Hiya, my name is Anna Berry and my artwork, The Constantly Moving Happiness Machine, is currently being shown at Forschungscampus Dahlem in Berlin. So I thought I'd make a short video just explaining some of the concepts behind the original work from 2018 and how I've adapted it for 2025. The Constantly Moving Happiness Machine works as a kind of metaphor for how our psychology allows us to be manipulated into participating in wider systems. And in the original iteration, this was about advertising kind of colonising our subconscious and then the individual's relationship to global consumer capitalism. So participants are kind of seduced by the artist, me, into turning the crank because they're charmed by the motion of the pleasing objects. A desire is gratified just as we feel good when we buy or consume. At the same time, the participant is unknowingly part of something arguably more sinister, a wider machine that they're animating. And upon closer inspection, the books from which these pretty things are constructed are very ideological texts whose ideas underpin the quite extreme end of market fundamentalism. I used Ayn Rand books in the original because I find them quite seductive manifestos for a level of individualism bordering on sociopathy. And I like that the piece almost becomes a kind of subversion of or the opposite of socially engaged art because I'm playing a nasty trick on the public and kind of manipulating them into being a sort of zombified metaphor. I was fascinated by the tacit consent we give to our subconscious being manipulated by advertising and PR, kind of shaping us into compliant consumers. So there's a kind of consensual colonisation of the subconscious. And there's an exploration of our role, particularly the grey area of consent as consumers in its first incarnation. The current version is broader, but it remains about our compliance with being sold ideas and still about what might be termed neoliberalism, whatever that actually means now, but in terms of toxic individualism along with the economic concerns of the original. So the original work was triggered by Adam Curtis's thoughts in Century of the Self about that particular moment around the 20s when a deliberate strategy was formulated to use the ideas of Freud to manipulate us into subconsciously attaching desires to objects we didn't need in order to create a consumer-driven economy. The title comes from a speech by President Hoover in 1928 to a group of men from the newly minted advertising and PR industries. You have taken over the job of creating desire and have transformed people into constantly moving happiness machines which have become the key to economic progress. So when I was approached to show the piece again, I had this nagging sense about it that it felt somehow anachronistic in 2025. What is encompassed by neoliberalism, what toxic individualism is, the processes to which we now give that tacit consent to be manipulated by, feel to have shifted to a very different place with technology particularly, and it kind of felt necessary to reflect that in the piece. So I guess the most obvious thing is that the new frontier feels like identity itself. Liberalism has obviously always been concerned with the individual, but this kind of cannibalistic Pac-Manning of identity in the self feels like a new level. The channels with which to manipulate our subconscious in today's world feel boundless. So accelerationism and particularly the mushrooming of the online space has led to a kind of disconnect even between self and materiality. We've become stuck in this very Cartesian brain in jar place. The self is something one merely curates by self-identifying into ever more granular and substanceless categories which come pre-packaged on social media with little flags and hair colours and require no calibration with reality. Consequently, we are meta-consumers, we consume our very selves. So it's fascinating how this incredibly new language of self-identification is marketed to us as progressive when it is hyperliberalism. I think consumption has always been wired into trying to move us away from embodied authenticity and plugging us into a sense of what we lack, which is whatever is to be sold to us. And we've moved into a further kind of simulacrum-like stage of postmodern consumerism where our identity itself is something to buy. So it's interesting to me that for younger generations, the idea that sort of inner feels might be calibrated against reality makes them queasy. Like reference to reality is almost a form of bigotry, such as the digital age wherein the self is curated, not discovered, and its relationship to reality, or what we might conceive of as truth, is severed altogether. And this ultra-individualistic kind of faux self-expression nestles really comfortably within the current wave of authoritarian ultra-collectivism or identitarianism, seemingly in contradiction, yet somehow in this manifestation utterly symbiotic. So you get this weird marriage of kind of toxic individualism with a warped version of collectivism, such that the individualism can hide, if not in plain sight, then within a kind of Trojan horse that self-identifies as social justice. So I think all of this is a kind of logical extension of Adam Curtis's original thesis, which inspired the piece in the first place, that collapse of progressivism into the navel-gazing and onanism of human potential and self-improvement in the 60s, into narcissism that he explores in Century of the Self. Obviously, it also calls forth the ghost of Fisher and capitalist realism, and this sense that we can no longer conceive of that which is out with capitalism. For me, it's genuinely fascinating that the Overton window for the left has shifted so much that an anti-capitalist or alternative to capitalist position is really absent. It feels like that kind of pushback from the left pretty much died with the Occupy movement. And meanwhile, it's the right from which explicitly anti-neoliberal policies like tariffs emerge. I don't really have an opinion on the economics of that stuff. It might sound like I do, but I'm not, in fact, an anti-capitalist. I'm not qualified to have an opinion on the economics. What's fascinating for me is the lack of stickiness of these economic ideas to one side or the other, and the migration back and forth. So it occurred to me just the other day, and this is kind of an aside, but there was a news story about this Irish band Kneecap leading an anti-Thatcher chant at Coachella, which I just found fascinating. It's just such pure and deep simulacrum. The kids in that crowd weren't born when Thatcher was around and aren't even from the same country. So the original referent is deeply lost. You know, they have no idea who Thatcher is. There's just this kind of folk devil narrative that remains. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. And then at the same time on the news, the new folk devil Trump is despised by exactly the same people, but for precisely the opposite reasons, for refrictioning trade by introducing tariffs, but there's no cognitive dissonance about that. So I find that incredibly interesting. Anyway, that anything other than kind of endless growth and the most frictionless trade is a possibility is not even in the Overton window of the left anymore. So whereas in the 90s it was the hard leftists protesting in Seattle about globalization, it's now the Trumpian right who would impose tariffs on the basis that, you know, supporting grassroots industry and workers' wages and conditions might be more important than being able to purchase an unencumbered array of cheap shite you didn't need from Temu, for example. So the kind of far left ideas of the 90s are now espoused by those who many consider to be an unpalatable right wing today. And isn't that fascinating? So Christopher Gage recently made what I thought was a really astute observation about millennial and Gen Z attitudes to the economy, saying they love gig work and tech capitalism, which is essentially Gilded Age feudalism. And I think that's a really apposite way of putting it, Gilded Age feudalism. Yeah, so I guess what's come to be termed woke capitalism is one of my least favourite flavours of capitalism so far. And to clarify again, I wouldn't regard myself today as an anti-capitalist. I'm fundamentally interested in the extremes of both individualism and collectivism and how we fail to balance them and what forces manipulate that and how our human frailty is used to do that. Anyway, mea culpa, as someone who was making arguments for stakeholder capitalism when I first showed this piece, I now kind of vomit a little bit in my mouth when corporations are kind of pantomiming their missions towards the whole human or the planet or inclusivity or social justice or whatever, and kind of pay their charge for indulgences by putting a pride flag in their Twitter bio, except of course not for their Saudi Arabia office, etc. And it's the perfect marriage of like old neoliberal economics with the new neoliberal intersectional left. I really like Adam Lehrer's writing on this. He says ideology branded as the politics of liberation is ultimately the politics of, at best, a slightly diversified bourgeoisie. And he talks about how art school teaches people to kind of superficially despise inequality and pretend to be communists and such, while simultaneously indoctrinating them to commodify their very identities. And we see a lot of this in the art world at the moment. So I guess it's hard to make sense of our current world beyond acknowledging that the old paradigms are no longer useful in parsing it. The left-right distinction is not a meaningful one beyond petty tribalism. I suspect the new axes are roughly materialist analysis versus postmodernist analysis and authoritarianism versus anti-authoritarianism. And certainly these two things are intimately related. If you attempt to control people's thoughts and perceptions by endlessly chanting things that obviously aren't true, interspersed with clap emojis, naturally a great deal of concomitant authoritarianism is also required. So these inversions and the sheer liquidity of the nature of consumerism and commodification of people and of the self is fascinating to me, and what was left is now right, and what's right is now left, and it's all very kind of, we have always been at war with East Asia, and it's like water, it finds its path and people simply kind of float atop it. So from the kind of hyper-enlightenment of random market fundamentalism to the kind of out-and-out anti-enlightenment of the contemporary left identitarians, both involve sacrificing one's humanity for ideology and ultimately worship the boundlessness of commodification and the relinquishing of control over our very desires to allow that to be achieved. So the texts that I've added to the original Rand texts are things that inform postmodern analysis and critical theory, and so foundational stuff like Foucault and Lyotard and a bit of Butler and that kind of thing. And I suppose the brief final thing to mention in passing, and I won't talk about this much, it's for perhaps a longer, more general explanation of my work, but the endless creating of material sculpture with books and texts in my practice is this kind of ever-present anxiety about the relationship of language to reality. That's in a lot of my work, including the original piece, because it's an issue that comes up very personally to me because of cognitive impairment. It's where my practice started, with kind of street and landscape interventions, literally making physical objects with texts, whilst I was on long-term disability benefit, and of course it's now reflected in my concern with progressivism's collapse into postmodernist ideas where roughly language is just kind of uprooted from real-world referent altogether. So overall, it's lovely that the piece has had a journey from being one of my very grassroots works shown in a random room in a library to an actual institution. Maybe outsider art is creeping within the boundaries, maybe even heterodox art is creeping within the boundaries. So please do enjoy the constantly moving happiness machine, which is at Forschungscampus Dahlem. I will learn to say that, Forschungscampus Dahlem in Berlin until July the 20th. Thank you.